A minute later they stumbled into a wide clearing and stopped short. Before them, in the middle of the clearing, stood a group of about 24 men and women. They stood still and quiet, facing Ford and Arthur. Around some of the women huddled small children, and behind the group was a ramshackle array of small dwellings made of mud and branches. Ford and Arthur held their breath. The tallest of the men stood a little over 5 feet high, and they all stooped forward slightly, had longish arms and lowish foreheads, and clear bright eyes with which they stared intently at the strangers. Seeing that they carried no weapons and made no move toward them, Ford and Arthur relaxed slightly. For a while, the two groups simply stared at each other, neither side making any move. The natives seemed puzzled by the intruders, and whilst they showed no signs of aggression, they were quite clearly not issuing any invitations. For a full 2 minutes, nothing continued to happen. After 2 minutes, Ford decided it was time something happened. "Hello," he said. The women drew their children slightly closer to them. The men made hardly any discernible move, and yet their whole disposition made it clear that the greeting was not welcome. It was not resented in any great degree, it was just not welcome. One of the men who had been standing slightly forward of the rest of the group, and who might therefore have been their leader, stepped forward. His face was quiet and calm, almost serene. He said quietly. This caught Arthur by surprise. He had grown so used to receiving an instantaneous and unconscious translation of everything he heard via the babblefish lodged in his ear that he had ceased to be aware of it, and was only reminded of its presence now by the fact that it didn't seem to be working. Vague shadows of meaning had flickered at the back of his mind, but there was nothing he could get a firm grasp on. He guessed, correctly as it happens, that these people had as yet evolved no more than the barest rudiments of language, and that the babblefish was therefore powerless to help. He glanced at Ford, who was infinitely more experienced in these matters. "I think," said Ford out of the corner of his mouth, "he's asking if we'd mind to walk on around the edge of the village." A moment later, a gesture from the man-creature seemed to confirm this. Continued the man-creature. "The general gist," said Ford, "as far as I can make out, is that we are welcome to continue our journey in any way we like. But if we would walk round his village rather than through it, it would make them all very happy. So what do we do?" "I think we make them happy," said Ford. Slowly and watchfully, they walked round the perimeter of the clearing. This seemed to go down very well with the natives, who bowed to them very slightly and then went about their business. Ford and Arthur continued their journey through the wood. A few 100 yards past the clearing, they suddenly came upon a small pile of fruit lying in their path, berries that looked remarkably like raspberries and blackberries, and pulpy green-skinned fruit that looked remarkably like pears. So far they had steered clear of the fruit and berries they had seen, though the trees and bushes were laden with them. "Look at it this way," Ford Prefect said. "Fruit and berries on strange planets either make you live or make you die. Therefore, the point at which you start toying with them is when you're going to die if you don't. That way you stay ahead. The secret of healthy hitchhiking is to eat junk food." They looked at the pile that laid in their path with suspicion. It looked so good, it almost made them dizzy with hunger. "Look at it this way," said Ford. "Yes?" said Arthur. "I'm trying to think of a way of looking at it which means we get to eat it," said Ford. The leaf-dappled sun gleamed on the pulp skins of the things which looked like the pears. The things which looked like raspberries and strawberries were fatter and riper than any Arthur had ever seen, even in ice cream commercials. "Why don't we eat them and think about it afterwards?" he said. "Maybe that's what they want us to do." "All right, look at it this way. Sounds good so far. It's there for us to eat. Either it's good or it's bad. Either they want to feed us or to poison us. If it's poisonous and we don't eat it, they'll just attack some other way. If we don't eat, we lose out either way." "I like the way you're thinking," said Ford. "Now eat one." Hesitantly, Arthur picked up one of those things that looked like pears. "I always thought that about the Garden of Eden story," said Ford. "Eh? Garden of Eden. Tree, apple, that bit, remember?" "Yes, of course I do. Your god person puts an apple tree in the middle of a garden and and says, "Do what you like, guys. Oh, but don't eat the apple." Surprise, surprise, they eat it, and he leaps out from behind a bush shouting, "Gotcha!" It wouldn't have made any difference if they hadn't eaten it. Why not? Because if you're dealing with somebody who has the storative mentality, which likes leaving hats on the pavement with bricks under them, you know perfectly well they won't give up. They'll get you in the end. What are you talking about? Never mind, eat the fruit. You know, this place almost looks like the Garden of Eden. Eat the fruit. Sounds quite like it too. Arthur took a bite from the thing which looked like a pear. "It's a pear," he said. A few moments later, when they had eaten a lot, Ford Prefect turned around and called out, "Thank you. Thank you very much," he called. "You're very kind." They went on their way. For the next 50 miles of their journey eastward, they kept finding the occasional gift of fruit lying in their path, and though they once or twice had a quick glimpse of a native man-creature amongst the trees, they never again made direct contact. They decided they rather liked a race of people who made it clear that they were grateful simply to be left alone. The fruits and berries stopped after 50 miles, because that was where the sea started. Having no pressing calls on their time, they built a raft and crossed the sea. It was reasonably calm, only about 60 miles wide, and they had a reasonably pleasant crossing, landing in a country that was at least as beautiful as the one they had left. Life was, in short, ridiculously easy, and for a while at least, they were able to cope with the problems of aimlessness and isolation by deciding to ignore them. When the craving for company became too great, they would know where to find it, but for the moment they were happy to feel that the Gallagher chants were hundreds of miles behind them. Nevertheless, Ford Prefect began to use his sub-ethos sensomatic more often again. Only once did he pick up a signal, but that was so faint and from such an enormous distance that it depressed him more than the silence that had otherwise continued unbroken. On a whim, they turned northwards. After weeks of traveling, they came to another sea, built another raft and crossed it. This time it was harder going. The climate was getting colder. Arthur suspected a streak of masochism in Ford Prefect. The increasing difficulty of the journey seemed to give him a sense of purpose that was otherwise lacking. He strode onward relentlessly. Their journey northwards brought them into steep mountain terrain of breathtaking sweeps of beauty. The vast, jagged, snow-covered peaks ravished their senses. The cold began to bite into their bones. They wrapped themselves in the animal skins and furs which Ford Prefect acquired by a technique he once learned from a couple of ex-prelate monks running a mind-surfing resort in the hills of Hunan. The galaxy is littered with ex-prelate monks, all on the make, because the mental control techniques the order has evolved as a form of devotional discipline are, frankly, sensational, and extraordinary numbers of monks leave the order just after they have finished their devotional training, and just before they take their final vows to stay locked in a small metal box for the rest of their lives. A few days after landing in this mountainous land, they hit a coastline which swept diagonally before them from southwest to the northeast, a coastline of monumental grandeur, deep majestic ravines, soaring pinnacles of ice, fjords. For 2 further days, they scrambled and climbed over the rocks and glaciers, awestruck with beauty. "Arthur!" yelled Ford suddenly. It was the afternoon of the second day. Arthur was sitting on a high rock, watching the thundering sea smashing itself against the craggy promenade trees. "Arthur!" yelled Ford again. Arthur looked to where Ford's voice had come from, carried faintly in the wind. Ford had gone to examine a glacier, and Arthur found him there, crouching by the solid wall of blue ice. He was tense with excitement. His eyes darted up to meet Arthur's. "Look!" he said. "Look!" Arthur looked. He saw a solid wall of blue ice. "Yes," he said. "It's a glacier. I've already seen it." "No," said Ford. "You've looked at it. You haven't seen it. Look." Ford was pointing deep into the heart of the ice. Arthur peered. He saw nothing but vague shadows. "Move back from it," Ford insisted. "Look again." Arthur moved back and looked again. "No," he said and shrugged. "What am I supposed to be looking for?" And suddenly he saw it. "You see it?" He saw it. His mouth started to speak, but his brain decided it hadn't got anything to say yet, and shut it again. His brain then started to contend with the problem of what his eyes told him they were looking at, but in doing so relinquished control of the mouth, which promptly fell open again. Once more, gathering up the jaw, his brain lost control of his left hand, which then wandered around in a nameless fashion. For a second or so, the brain tried to catch the left hand without letting go of the mouth, and simultaneously tried to think about what was buried in the ice, which is probably why the legs went and Arthur dropped restfully to the ground. The thing that had been causing all the neural upset was a network of shadows in the ice, about 18 inches beneath the surface. Looked at from the right angle, they resolved into the solid shapes of letters from an alien alphabet, each about 3 feet high, and for those, like Arthur, who could read in Magnatherian, there was above the letters the outline of a face hanging in the ice. It was an old face, thin and distinguished, careworn but not unkind. It was the face of the man who had won an award for designing the coastline they now knew themselves to be standing on.
I hope you'll join us at the restaurant at the end of the universe when the next chapter drops very soon.